the island that refused the world and paid the price. While the rest of the world accelerated toward trade, connection, and expansion, one island chose withdrawal, believing distance would protect its identity and preserve control. Closing itself off felt like strength, a way to avoid exploitation, an outside influence in an era of growing pressure. This story matters today because isolation is often mistaken for security, especially when change feels threatening and unpredictable. Many societies still believe that refusing engagement can freeze the world in place, keeping tradition intact while danger passes elsewhere. The appeal of withdrawal is deeply human, rooted in the instinct to protect what is familiar from forces that cannot be controlled. But history reveals that refusing the world rarely stops the world from arriving on its own terms. At the moment this decision was made, the island faced rising contact from foreign powers, expanding trade routes, and cultural shifts that challenged long-standing customs. Leaders feared that opening the door would invite domination rather than cooperation. They had watched other regions surrender autonomy to foreign interests in exchange for trade and technology, and they concluded that the only reliable defense was refusal itself. At first, the results seemed reassuring. Foreign presence declined, internal order remained stable, and the population felt protected from outside turmoil. The rhythms of daily life continued without disruption, and the absence of foreign influence was interpreted as proof that the strategy was working. But isolation does more than block influence. It also slows learning, adaptation, and awareness of how quickly the world beyond is changing. Knowledge that circulates freely between connected societies stagnates when borders close, and innovations that might take years to develop independently can be absorbed in months through exchange. As global systems evolved, technologies advanced, and economies connected, the island remained still, convinced separation was control. What it did not realize was how fast the world would move forward without it. This was the beginning of a price that would only become visible much later. As years passed, the effects of isolation became harder to dismiss, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual disadvantages knowledge, technology, and opportunity accumulated elsewhere. Trade networks evolved without the island, leaving its economy increasingly narrow and dependent on limited internal production rather than shared growth. Markets that once could have been accessed through partnership were now controlled by networks the island had no part in building, and breaking into them later would require concessions far greater than early participation would have cost. Innovation slowed, not because of lack of intelligence or effort, but because ideas circulate through contact, and isolation starves progress quietly. Solutions to problems that other societies solved through collaboration had to be reinvented independently on the island, consuming time and resources that connected nations spent on advancement instead. Generations grew up with a shrinking window to the outside world, learning less about global shifts and more about preserving what already existed. Education focused inward, reinforcing traditions and values that provided cultural continuity, but left citizens unprepared for complexity accumulating beyond their shores. Leaders defended the policy as cultural protection, even as gaps widened between the island and rapidly advancing societies beyond its shores. The rhetoric of preservation grew louder as the evidence of falling behind became harder to ignore, and criticism of the policy was increasingly treated as disloyalty rather than concern. What once felt like control now required constant enforcement, as maintaining separation demanded increasing effort and restriction. Citizens who sought contact with the outside world were monitored. Trade that might introduce foreign influence was limited, and information itself became something to be managed rather than shared. The island was still sovereign, still intact, but it was falling behind in ways that statistics could not fully explain. The gap was not just material but intellectual, as the island's understanding of the world grew increasingly outdated, while the world's understanding of the island faded into irrelevance. Isolation had succeeded in keeping the world out, but it had also kept the future away. And the cost of that distance was beginning to surface. The conflict emerged when isolation stopped being a choice and became a constraint, as the island faced challenges it could no longer manage alone. Economic pressure intensified as limited trade reduced resilience, making shortages, inefficiency, and stagnation harder to ignore. Resources that were once sufficient for a self-contained society proved inadequate when population grew. Infrastructure aged, and the demands of governance outpaced what internal production could support. External powers, once distant, now held overwhelming advantages, not through aggression, but through advancement the island could not match. The technological and economic gap that had widened quietly during decades of withdrawal now represented a strategic vulnerability that no amount of cultural resolve could compensate for. Internally, frustration grew as younger generations questioned policies that restricted opportunity while offering little protection in return. Those who had grown up under isolation began comparing their circumstances to what they could glimpse of life beyond the island's borders, and the comparison fueled discontent that leaders could no longer dismiss as foreign contamination. Attempts to selectively re-engage proved difficult, because rebuilding trust and connections after long absence required concessions leaders were unwilling to make. The world had moved on, forming partnerships, establishing norms, and building institutions that the island had no standing in, and rejoining those systems meant accepting rules written by others. The buildup reached a critical point when remaining isolated began to threaten stability more than engagement ever had. The very survival that isolation was meant to guarantee was now at risk because of it. What was once framed as preservation now looked like vulnerability, exposing the island to pressure it tried to avoid. Isolation had protected identity, but at the cost of adaptability, leaving society rigid in a flexible world. The island now faced a dilemma with no easy exit: remain isolated and decline, or open up and face sudden disruption. History had reached a moment where refusal carried greater risk than change. The climax arrived when the island finally confronted the limits of withdrawal, realizing that isolation had preserved the past but weakened the future. What once felt like control had quietly become dependence on outdated systems and shrinking options. Re-engagement came too late to avoid cost, requiring painful adjustments as the island struggled to catch up in a world that no longer waited. Identity survived, but influence did not return easily. The island found itself negotiating from a position of disadvantage, forced to accept terms it might have shaped had it participated earlier, and carrying the weight of decades of lost development that no policy could instantly recover. The resolution is not that isolation is always wrong, but that it carries a price rarely paid immediately. Protection can become stagnation when connection is refused for too long. This story matters today because withdrawal still tempts societies facing uncertainty, promising safety while hiding long-term consequences. History reminds us that survival depends not only on defense, but on participation. The island endured, but it paid with lost time, lost opportunity, and diminished voice. So, what do you think? Was isolation ever truly protection? The